Pantages, Chapter 4, The Movie Palace. By 1911, the number of theaters in the United States swelled to 11,500. Pantages became a builder of theaters all over the western U.S. and Canada. His favorite architect in these ventures was Priteca. His long association with the architect began and continued through the 1920s. Pantages heightened the experience of attending a movie or vaudeville show by not only attracting top talent, but also creating sumptuously designed theaters that could themselves be draws. He sought to make his theaters as inviting as the acts that played in them. As his empire grew, Pantages recognized that audiences could be interested in the entertainment, but also in a theater's interior. Thus began a move towards ever more elegant and sophisticated theaters. It began around 1910, and it soon sped up as one theater owner tried to outdo the next. In time, theater buildings became the temples of the 20th century American city. Movie cathedrals replaced, in both architectural grandeur and cultural impact, the dominance of churches and temples. A key figure in furthering this movement was the brilliant Scots architect B.Marcus Priteca. The Jewish-Scottish immigrant Priteca learned his trade as an apprentice at a prestigious architectural firm in Scotland, while also attending Edinburgh University. But he yearned to see the world. He said, "I was feeling pretty smart, and I got into an office discussion about a city in the United States called Seattle." Soon enough, he landed there. Eventually, he met Pantages, and the result was a long 2 decades-long collaboration. The early theaters Pantages built shared many classical stylistic features or medieval motifs and similar details, including domed ceilings and generous use of stained glass, as well as other stylistic flourishes that suggested opulence. Gilt and bronze glowed in the interiors, and murals and tapestries complemented the inlaid marble floors. Priteca devised an exotic neoclassical style that his employer declared to be Pantages Greek. Priteca fashioned theaters into urban temples, with interior spaces that resembled palatial estates, and exterior features that attracted the eye as well as the imagination. Many Pantages theaters dominated the city blocks in which they were built, purposefully, not only to make a cultural and business statement, but in the same way that churches dominated the urban landscape in Europe and some parts of the United States, but also to send a strong message of the growing power and attraction of film to the region. From a marketing standpoint, it was brilliant thinking, but not a little uncontroversial. Many traditionalists, particularly church leaders, chafed under the onslaught, and the result was a brewing culture war between conservatives and progressives that has yet to be settled. Pantages knew that in growing and expanding leisure choices available to audiences, film theaters had to stand out to compete with other activities, particularly for working-class families. 2 hours in a Pantages theater meant being in an ornate royal palace. For those struggling to make ends meet and raise families, this was a seductive form of escapism and fantasy. For many members of the audience, often the acts or films playing in a Pantages theater was secondary to simply being in the theater itself. Unlike other theater operators, Pantages and Priteca focused on details. Pantages insisted his operations always being clean and well-maintained, and he selected ushers for their neatness and strong professionalism. Priteca's skillful exterior use of terracotta offered architectural flexibility, but also a certain sunny, vibrant style, and it took patrons into walled gardens of relaxation and pomp. It placed them in a better mood, thus enhancing the effectiveness of the shows or movies being presented. As few other exhibitors had done in this time, Pantages and Priteca turned theater-going into social and cultural addiction. Priteca designed 30 theaters for Pantages. Just a vaudeville architect, he called himself, the cigar-smoking Priteca combined exterior pomp and interior elegance with gracefully curving balconies, sloping floors, and good sight lines to the stage from every seat in the house. "Seeing is hearing," he proclaimed. Priteca turned Pantages' visions into reality. Pantages sought to make his vaudeville billings distinct and novel, and he put much stock in the character of his theater buildings as well. Pantages encountered Priteca, then only 21 years old, in a chance meeting, and after some discussions, commissioned him to design the San Francisco Pantages Theater. The site in San Francisco presented some challenges, which the young Priteca met to Pantages' satisfaction, and the theater opened its doors in December of 1911. Image was an all-important element in the building of his empire. Pantages intuitively understood that the impressions he made on the public were critical in how audiences would accept him, a dictum of his leadership style that he practiced all throughout his career. Significantly, he also knew that he and he alone had to be in charge of cultivating his brand. He did not allow others to do it for him. After all, his name was on the marquees of his theaters. In San Francisco, the Pantages Theater opened on December 30th, 1911. This was B.Marcus Priteca and Alexander Pantages' first combined effort, and led the way for many theaters to follow in a similar Pantages style. In June 1911, the architect and engineer of California published this item. Architect B.Marcus Priteca of Seattle will open offices in San Francisco in the near future. He is associated with Messrs. Miller and Comelsnil in designing the new Pantages Theater to be erected on Market Street by the A.E. Long Construction Company. In addition to the theater, a 7-story Class A office building will be put up. Priteca's offices will be in the West Bank building. Miller and Comelsnil were listed as the architects for the project in an item in the July 4, 1911 issue of the San Francisco Trade Journal, Building and Industrial News, which noted that the contract for the structural steel and iron work on the project had just been awarded to the Central Iron Works. Given the fact that Priteca was Pantages' protege, hired specifically to design theaters, he undoubtedly designed the theater interior. But as he still had only limited experience as an architect, in fact he was only 22 years old at the time, it seems most likely that Miller and Comelsnil, an established firm familiar with San Francisco's building codes, designed the building itself. They surely would have designed the office building fronting the theater. Around 1907, James Rupert Miller and George T. de Comelsnil hired Timothy Pfluger, then 15 years old, as an apprentice. In the late 1910s, after Comelsnil withdrew from the firm, Pfluger became a partner in the firm of Miller and Pfluger. As he had been with the firm for several years at the time the Pantages was built, it's likely that he was involved in the project in some way, perhaps quite extensively. It's easy to imagine Pfluger being impressed with the accomplishments of Priteca, who was less than 3 years his elder. Perhaps his involvement with Pantages' project had some influence on his decision to design theaters later in his career. By 1912, Klondike Kate decided that she might do better in California. It was an unwise move, and she found herself jobless and penniless, even driven to approach Alexander Pantages for money. He gave her all that he had in his pockets, $6. With the money from Pantages and some that she'd earned from waitressing, she made her way back to Oregon. Back in Oregon, Kate struggled to survive as a fry cook in Bend. At the age of 39, finally married briefly to a young handsome cowboy named Floyd Warner, who was only 20 years old. They eloped, recalled Kate. One of those spur-the-moment and spur-the-horse things, she said. They ran a small herd of cattle. Kate would take off. She missed city life. Floyd thought she was cheating. She may have been. Kate never was super committed. Kate remained conflicted about the man she loved. After 3 years, she got her homestead. In 1914, World War I started. The Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28th, and by the end of August, Germany, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom had joined the war. The United States entered the fray on April 6, 1917, by declaring war on Germany. During the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, miners were fired upon who were striking. In retaliation, the miners attacked dozens of mines over the next 10 days. Congress ordered an investigation into the Ludlow Massacre. As a result, 8-hour days and child labor laws were enacted. There were 18,000 movie theaters in the country, with 7 million daily admissions. Pantages built the Pantages Playhouse in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba. It became the starting point of the Pantages Theatre Circuit, where all Pantages tours originated and moved from there around his circuit of theaters. Winnipeg's vaudeville patrons, no doubt, enjoyed the amount of influence their reactions bore, as an act's fate was largely determined by its success at this particular theater. Pantages theaters were also built in Vancouver, Edmonton, and Victoria. Pantages Vaudeville became a brand associated with high quality and popularity. Even as he divided his theatrical exhibition between live acts and film, he was at heart a vaudevillian. Al Jolson, W.C. Fields, Mae West, Buster Keaton, the Marx Brothers, Jimmy Durante, Bill Bojangles Robinson, Edgar Bergen, Fanny Bryce, Burns and Allen, James Cagney, Eddie Cantor were all playing Pantages Circuit. The performances of Fatty Arbuckle and Mabel Normand were of consequence, as they were established performers, only a few years away from their big break in silent films. Arbuckle, roly-poly, fat and young, hadn't learned a thing save falling on his backside, but he got laughs. Miss Normand, young and attractive, was the butt of the ribald jokes of the alleged comedians of the troupe. There was no chorus, but everybody in the cast sang a bit and did a little tap dancing, just as the occasion required. Pantages tied himself to vaudeville and did not relinquish its hold on his operations until well into the 1920s, by which time films had long left vaudeville behind as the preferred entertainment choice by mainstream American audiences. Pantages had greater control over his vaudeville acts than with the films he exhibited. Unlike movies, rented from distributors for a set fee, with little room to maneuver or negotiate fees, Pantages contracted with vaudeville acts directly and could, and often did, reduce their agreed fee. It would become standard practice in his operations. Performers would sign an agreement for a specific fee, only to see it reduced by 25% after the act had started its theatrical tour. The actors could either continue at the reduced rate or halt their performances and be left stranded. Most of the performers faced with this situation took the pay cut to keep from becoming destitute in a strange and unfamiliar area. Few actors took the matter to court, where Pantages most often than not settled before a full-blown trial ensued. Perhaps used to the swanky lifestyle acquired in his time with Klondike Kate, or recalling his poverty in Greece and Egypt, Pantages burned for wealth and status. Not content with a middle-class lifestyle, he pursued riches as a matter of personal pride. To do so meant he had to have more than one theater. With each new theater, he also gained leverage over the vaudeville actors who contracted with him. At some point, it must have dawned on him that the more theaters he owned or managed, the greater the pull of vaudeville acts into his operations. It is likely that he watched other vaudeville theater owners do the same and simply copied the practice. It was no more work to contract with a vaudeville act to book into one theater than it was to book an act into several theaters. Thus, the economies of theatrical production favored multiple operations. It was also the preferred choice of vaudeville talent who could be employed for longer periods with a theater chain than with a single operation. A second Pantages theater started construction in the same Vancouver area as the first one at 20 West Hastings Street, beginning in 1914, but not finished until 1917 due to World War I. It was also known as the Beacon, the Odeon Hastings, and finally as the Majestic. It was demolished in 1967 for a parking lot. Back in the States, Klondike Kate worked for a bit as a vaudeville headliner and even teamed up with roller skating champion Jimmy Ray. However, Kate's depression grew deeper, and by 1914, a knee injury caused her to leave the stage forever. She suffered a nervous breakdown, and on doctor's orders, she left Seattle and moved to the quiet Oregon country, opening a new chapter in her life, homesteading east of Bend, near Milliken, where she homesteaded 320 acres of dry land. After performing for years on stage, even into her 40s, Kate Rockwell headed to Brothers, Oregon with $3,500 in cash and $3,000 worth of jewelry, and trunks filled with dresses, gowns, and hats. Kate was one of a growing number of women who worked to prove up her parcel of land by living on the claim for the required 5 years. This was shortly after women had earned the right to vote in Oregon. She was known to have worked the land and to work in her garden in vaudeville gowns and dance slippers. While waiting out the 5 years to earn the title to the land, Rockwell fell in love with and married a cowboy named Floyd Warner, her first husband, a mysterious, handsome cowboy who courted her by mail. In 1915, a second and larger Pantages theater opened in Seattle. It stood at the corner of 3rd Avenue and University Street. Pantages commissioned the design of the muralist and decorative painter Anthony B. Heinsbergen. In collaboration with Priteca, they regularly worked together and designed and oversaw the construction of 22 elaborate theater buildings for Pantages, as far afield as Edmonton, Kansas City, and Memphis. The grandeur of the theaters was not only stylistic, none was small, and the largest of them could accommodate well over 2,000 spectators. As a girl, Pantages' daughter Carmen appeared at the openings of her Greek immigrant father's theaters, along with her 2 older brothers. Alexander Pantages founded his first theaters in Seattle and Tacoma. The industry was not simply the stars and production crew who regularly worked long hours to produce films, but also exhibitors who spent many hours tending to business. The very nature of the work involved also contributed to assimilation. For a theater owner like Pantages, there was never really any time off. Managing dozens of theaters was round-the-clock work that required constant attention. Under such circumstances, when the focus was on ensuring financial stability and profit, the immigrant had to let go of the past to focus on the present. Pantages had a reputation for hard work and long hours. It is impossible for him to operate otherwise, particularly given his illiteracy. As his children grew into adults, they assisted his father, but he still ran the operation more or less on his own. It is also a telling fact that his children did not grow up speaking Greek, which further distanced Pantages from his former homeland. In 1916, Pantages Showcase Theater was at the 7th and Hill Street in downtown LA. It also housed his offices. That Pantages Theater, better known as a Warner Theater, is now the Jewelry Mart. By 1917, Kate had stayed at her claim in Oregon for the requisite 7 years, making improvements to the land and outbuildings. In 1917, she sold the land and moved to Bend, 40 miles to the northwest. She built a lodging house at 231 Franklin Street, since demolished, which was a landmark in the town for many years. Known as Aunt Kate during her 30 years in Bend, where she retired after a life of adventure in Yukon. In Central Oregon, Kate worked a variety of jobs, such as washing dishes, operating a rooming house, and running a convalescent home. Although the work was menial, she remained queen-like. She later recalled, "All this time I managed to hang on to my memory-loaded jewelry. I can remember the queer looks on the faces of customers, seeing me up to my elbows in soap suds with $1,000 worth of diamonds in each ear." A few years later, an optimistic Klondike Kate bought a restaurant. In 1918, World War I ended. Pantages had stumbled and fallen a few times, but by the end of World War I, he had put together one of the most successful theater circuits in the U.S. He was the sole owner of $5 million worth of theaters. Hard work, an exceptional memory, and personal involvement in all aspects of his business brought Pantages quick success and led to an Alexandrian campaign of theater house acquisitions and constructions. He said, "I shall not be happy till I own a chain of houses from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Toboggans to the Everglades." During the 1910s, his theater circuit dominated the American West. Pantages' daughter Carmen danced a jig at the opening of the Tacoma Pantages Theater while her mother played the violin. On May 29th, while walking with his son Fred, Friedrich Trump suddenly felt extremely sick and was rushed to bed. The next day he was dead. Trump was first diagnosed with pneumonia, but as it turned out, he was one of the early cases of the 1918 flu pandemic, one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history. It caused millions of deaths around the world. Trump was 49 years old. At his death, his net holdings included a 2-story, 7-room home in Queens, 5 vacant lots, $4,000 in savings, $3,600 in stocks, and 14 mortgages. Altogether, his net worth was $31,359, the equivalent of almost $1 million in today's value. Trump's wife and son Fred continued his real estate projects under the Elizabeth Trump and Son moniker. Klondike Kate came into money and bought a 2-story house in Bend at 221 Franklin Street. It was across the street from St. Charles Hospital. She added a front porch, and it became a Bend landmark. Kate had collected rocks in Central Oregon that she used for her chimney. She took in boarders and was a friend of the Bend Fire Department. She followed their sirens and often delivered coffee and sandwiches for her boys, who called her Aunt Kate. Kate made a shrine for St. Charles Hospital. They made her a parade master. Kate was settled in Bend, Oregon, where she sponsored prison reforms, adoptions, and feeding the homeless. She traveled from Bend to Prineville to visit hospitals and help with the flu, where she held the hands of old sourdoughs that couldn't be moved and nursed the sick during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Kate was never scared. In Bend, the rumor was Kate was a prostitute. She made trips to LA until 1929. She may have blackmailed Pantages, as exposing his illegitimate son would ruin his good name. Kate eventually left Bend and returned to Vaudeville for 4 years. She played Seattle, Vancouver, and San Francisco. Kate was a master of self-promotion. She would let newspapers know in advance of her arrival. In Portland, Oregon, she arranged for her own police escort. In 1919, anarchists sent 300 letter bombs to people including Rockefeller. The letters would say, "The labor is worthy of his hire. No man should be a slave." In 1919, the Volstead Act, which prohibited the production, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors, made a lot of crooks rich. In 1920, Pantages came to own more than 30 vaudeville theaters and controlled, through management contracts, perhaps 60 more in both the United States and Canada. These theaters formed the Pantages Circuit, a chain of theaters into which he could book and rotate touring acts on long-term contracts. A ruthless but intensely hard-working businessman, Pantages invested his theatrical profits into new outlets and eventually moved to Los Angeles and bought an elegant and expansive mansion in Los Angeles. It was a Mediterranean mansion, including 5 marble bathrooms on a 5-acre lot. Built between 1906 and 1908 by Los Angeles architect Edwin Bergstrom for himself and his young wife. As the legend goes, somewhere around 1913, 14, or 15, Bergstrom sold the property for $100,000 to Alexander de la Garza, a man described as belonging to one of Mexico's most distinguished families. He came to Los Angeles with $1 million to purchase guns and ammunition for Pancho Villa's revolutionary forces in Mexico. He sold ammunition for a profit and kept the money, which enraged Pancho Villa. So Pancho Villa seized a prominent U.S. citizen in Mexico and demanded an exchange for de la Garza. So de la Garza sold his estate to Pantages, known at the time as the Great God Pan, and fled to Europe. Pantages entered into partnership with the motion picture distributor Famous Players, a subsidiary of film producer Paramount Pictures, and further expanded his combo houses, designed to exhibit films as well as staging live vaudeville, to new sites in western U.S. The switch to film in the 3rd decade of the century was another example of his remarkable focus on what customers wanted. Despite his obvious predilection for vaudeville, Pantages followed his customers' demands and made film the center focus of his empire. During this time, class divisions began to widen and grow more pronounced, which resulted in competing aims for upper, middle, and lower class citizens. The rapid pace at which industrialization unfolded during the 1880s began to alienate working class wage earners who sought to preserve a sense of decency and honor in their work. In some communities, this goal was respected, But many found that as society focused increasingly on financial success, old customs, traditions, and morality dissolved. As movies grew in stature and audiences, the immigrants who helped build the industry came under attack. Greeks learned to keep their heads down and focused on their work. The mistake that Pantages made was to exercise risky behavior at a time when Hollywood was already on the defensive regarding its morals and conduct. Stories about famous film stars advanced the relationship between audience and industry while also promoting Hollywood's main product, movies. This force extended to directors, writers, producers, and even exhibitors. The Pantages brand was a powerful one and placed him front and center. In the minds of audiences, he was a purveyor of escapism and entertainment, while also engaging their emotions. Pantages' cultural and financial success brought him a measure of stature in the field and in the general public, which helped in his adoption into American society. But what cemented this adoption was that he was an instrument behind the nation's dreams. As such, he held a special place in the loyalties of his customers that aided his integration into mainstream society. Notwithstanding his decades-long competition with his nemesis John Consolidation, on February 13th, in a United Press article, Carmen Pantages to wed Consolidation, Hollywood, February 13th, UP. Carmen Pantages, attractive young daughter of Alexander Pantages, millionaire theater owner, will be married here Sunday to John Consolidation Jr., motion picture producer. After the ceremony, the couple will leave immediately for New York by boat. In 1920, Alexander Pantages adopted Marjorie Nelson, born in Japan in 1908, and nicknamed her Dixie. Second cousin of director Howard Hawks, Jane Peters, aka Carol Lombard, was often doubled by her old Virgil Jr. school friend, Dixie Pantages. Carol was signed to a one-picture contract in 1921 when she was 12. The film in question was A Perfect Crime. In 1925, she passed a screen test and was signed to a contract with Fox Films. Dixie and Carol went on to become best friends, attending Fairfax High School together in the middle of boomtown Hollywood. This was the jazz age. They both started as flappers. Lombard was elected May Queen in 1924 and quit school soon thereafter to pursue acting full-time. A natural tomboy who joined in her brother's roughhousing, Lombard dated the son of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. Dixie had an even more unusual background than Lombard herself did. Dixie was born in extreme poverty, but when her mother died, she was adopted by the wealthy Pantages family so that their own daughter, a childhood playmate of Dixie's, could have a sister. When that happened, her name changed legally from Dixie Nelson to Dixie Pantages as a result of the adoption becoming legal. Former actress Marion Davies, the mistress of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, was maid of honor at Carmen's wedding. Carmen often visited Hearst's San Simeon Ranch on the Central California coast. "We learned to swim in Hearst's pool," said Carmen's son Tim Consolidation, a writer and former child actor. "My three sons and Spin and Marty." For 45 years, Mrs. Consolidation and one of her late brothers went every Monday to bring movies and serve food to paralyzed veterans at hospitals near Los Angeles. She also loved throwing parties for veterans at her home. September 16, 1920, a bomb exploded outside J.P. Morgan's offices in New York, killing 20 people. In 1921, the Pantages circuit dominated the vaudeville and motion picture market in North America west of the Mississippi River. As the social attraction of films grew from their lowbrow beginnings, so did the cultural standing of those involved in their enterprise. It is instructive to note the difference between the malaria-ridden 13-year-old Pantages entering the United States and the mogul living in a lavish life in Los Angeles in the 1920s. Hollywood is said to be many things, including real estate, but also a state of mind. Like few industries of the time, it included a diverse variety of backgrounds and, in one sense, fashioned them all into uniquely American personalities. Wealth and social prestige followed. How this took place is still a matter of study. Whether voluntary or involuntary, the change was profound. Perhaps there is no better example of this shift than Pantages. That the movie industry was famous for its many immigrants, almost all the major studios were either founded, run, or involved immigrants, is another telling example that there was something inherent in Hollywood that encouraged assimilation. Many immigrant Jews responded to their new status as movie producers by seeking to become less Jewish, by marrying Gentiles, adopting mainstream American customs, and reaching for a more generic appearance to their business interactions. The fact that they could become captains of their industry in the same way that Pantages became a leading movie theater owner and exhibitor at the time certainly encouraged their assimilation. While there were other Greek film exhibitors in the country at the time, most notably the Skouras brothers in St. Louis, Missouri, and the Karasotes family in Chicago, Pantages' chain was the most geographically expansive and the largest and the most nationally well-known of all Greek American exhibitors. Pantages went further than other theater owners. Although Pantages was effectively blocked from expansion into the Eastern market by New York-based Keith Albee Orpheum, his circuit was the dominant market force in the West. Much of his success was due to his insistence on booking only top-quality, crowd-pleasing entertainment, coupled with his perfected system of high audience turnover. Jack Benny, Irving Berlin, Abbott and Costello, Kate Smith, Cary Grant, Bob Hope, Milton Berle, Judy Garland, Rose Marie, Sammy Davis Jr., Red Skelton, and the Three Stooges were all playing his circuit. At his peak, Pantages had under his control over 70 theater houses. Throughout the 1920s, Pantages' empire suffered from the general decline in theater audiences because of the competition from films. He suffered an emotional breakdown in 1922. Pantages' venture into motion picture distribution was not unsuccessful, but by then the genre of vaudeville had already begun to be eclipsed by the new medium of motion pictures, and Pantages' decision to remain faithful to his roots in live theater contributed to the decline of both his fortunes and his health thereafter. His ties to his homeland seemed mercurial. He never set foot on Greece again, although he did assist his relatives financially and even brought his brother Nicholas to live in the United States. He used to call himself King Greek, perhaps an emulation of Louis B. Mayer's Super Jew. Despite helping to eventually bring two members of his immediate family to the United States, it seems that Pantages had little interest in joining or participating in the affairs of his diaspora community. For instance, there are no records that he donated any funds to the building of the Greek Orthodox Church in Seattle, even though with his wealth he was in a favorable position to do so. He married a non-Greek and adopted his host country's lifestyle, christening his children Lloyd, Rodney, and Carmen in non-Greek names. He may have assiduously avoided any contact with other Greek Americans, or simply turned his back on his ethnic culture. The rise of Pantages in exhibition presented a dilemma for other Greek Americans. To honor him meant acknowledging the influence of motion pictures on a society that antagonized a certain portion of it who regarded the industry as corrupt and vile, while at the same time, in doing so, emphasizing more of the Greek part of Greek America. They could seem less than patriotic. Historians link the decline of vaudeville to the rising prominence of motion pictures and radio during the 1910s and 1920s. The Keith Albee circuit theaters began to show the first signs of financial struggles in 1922, and by 1926, economic problems were widespread throughout the circuit. After World War I, Kate's husband Floyd returned to her. She divorced him in 1922. In 1923, in the fall, Pantages and his family lived on North Vermont Avenue. Walt Disney came to see Pantages in room 211 of his downtown theater building. Walt said, "Finally I managed to sell Alexander Pantages on the idea of me making a special little joke reel for his theaters on the order of topics of the day," Walt recalled. At first he tried to sell Pantages' assistant, Carl Walker, on the special little joke reel with the name Pantages splashed all over it, to add prestige and keep the name Pantages before his theater patrons. Pantages overheard Walt's pitch to the assistant as he explained his idea of turning out a weekly joke reel, a sort of topics of the day affair. The assistant was not convinced by Walt, but Pantages was. He was interested, Walt recalled, but wanted to see more of my work. Pantages told Walt, "I think you have a good idea. Make up a sample, and if it's all you describe, you've got a deal." Walt returned to Robert's garage where he set about drawing up a sample reel. He began to work on the Pantages joke reel using what he called my little stick figure, with heads that had mouths and eyes. The characters told each other jokes, which were written in type above them. The settings were simple. The figures appeared near a tree or under a sky with a moon. "The best way I can describe these," Walt said, "is to say that they looked like white matchsticks on a black background." On October 15th, as Disney started work on Pantages' reel, he received a telegram from Margaret Winkler, an independent distributor in New York, offering $1,500 each for 6 episodes for a series of pictures like his Alice reel, which he had sent back east to Margaret, as well as with others 5 months earlier. On October 23rd, Pantages bought a Hollywood site for a $2 million office building and theater. Years earlier, when Klondike Kate was hard up, she had come to Los Angeles and mustered the nerve to knock on the door of Pantages' Vermont Avenue mansion. A servant ushered her into the kitchen. "I thought up until then he was the one man in all the world who would not fail me," she said later. "He gave me $6. She refused it and walked out. On another occasion, he suggested Kate was not too old to go on the street. But Kate persisted, hiring a lawyer. By that time, Pantages was the sole owner of 22 vaudeville theaters and controlled interest in another 28, for which he had been offered $10 million. He was known as a man of integrity, conducting multi-million-dollar deals on a mere handshake, and he was very much a family man bent on protecting Lois and their children from the bad publicity another lawsuit from Klondike Kate would bring. Kate may also have had some sway over Pantages because of their child, Lotus, she had in Dawson. But whatever the cause, Pantages made cash deliveries to her during this period. In 1924, at the peak of his career, the height of his empire, the Pantages theater circuit owned or operated 84 vaudeville theaters spread across the United States and Canada, virtually all under his direct personal management. In addition to his operations in Canada, Pantages dominated the West Coast, but he also made important inroads in the Midwest and got as east as Memphis, Tennessee. While Dixie was at Fairfax High, Carmen attended the exclusive Westlake School for Girls. Fine homes and fashion, world travel, and famous friends filled her life from childhood in Seattle to adulthood in Los Angeles. In 1925, compromising his personal affinity for live theater, and under his personal guidance, Pantages remodeled his 1915 theater and announced an initiative to open a circuit of motion picture theaters. Thereafter, the theater accommodated various uses as motion pictures gradually supplanted live vaudeville theater. On February 13, 1926, when the new Pantages Theater, later named the Orpheum Theater, opened at 1192 Market Street, it replaced the one that was opened in 1911. In 1927, Sid Grauman opened his Chinese Theater. Norma Talmadge inspired the footprint ceremonies tradition when she accidentally stepped into wet concrete as she arrived for the opening of her film The Dove. On February 14th, Dixie married Orlando Slim Martin in Pantages' home. On October 1st, Pantages took a lease on the Forum Theater, hitherto an independent house with one of the largest seating capacities in Los Angeles. His lease was short-term. The Forum was a flop for the last 6 months, and its future would depend on Pantages' success. By 1927, all gold mining interests in the Yukon were consolidated and bought by the Guggenheim family's Yukon Gold Company. 1929 began as a landmark year. 1 out of 4 Americans could dance the Charleston. In January, Popeye and Tintin and All Quiet on the Western Front first appeared. Then the St. Valentine's Day Massacre occurred, where 7 gangsters rivaling Al Capone were murdered in Chicago. In March, the San Francisco Bay Toll Bridge opened, then the world's longest, and Herbert Hoover was sworn in as the 31st President of the United States. In May, the first Academy Awards are presented in a 15-minute ceremony at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel. In June, Vatican City gained independence from Italy and created its own state, and the first public demonstration of color TV was held by H.E. Ives and his colleagues at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New York. In August, the SS San Juan collided with the oil tanker SCT Dodd off the California coast, causing the San Juan to sink in 3 minutes, killing 77 people. In July, the Geneva Convention addressed the treatment of prisoners of war, and in October, the stock market crashed. In November, the Museum of Art, MoMA, was created in New York City. In 1929, talented vaudeville performers offered urban Americans fast-paced variety entertainment that matched their lifestyle better than other forms of popular entertainment, attracting customers by the million. Big-time vaudeville producers enforced standards designed to appeal to middle-class respectability. However, in doing so, vaudeville contributed to deepening social and cultural divisions in American society. Alexander Pantages, a Greek immigrant, had built his chain of vaudeville movie houses from scratch into a multi-million-dollar business across the western half of the United States. Those in the know thought him worth $30 million. Jack Benny, Irving Berlin, Abbott and Costello, Kate Smith, Cary Grant, Bob Hope, Milton Berle, Judy Garland, Rose Marie, Sammy Davis Jr., Red Skelton, and the Three Stooges were all playing his circuit. The rapid growth of the film industry during the 1920s put pressure on Pantages' vaudeville empire and eventually led to his demise in 1929. In mid-April, he reached a tentative agreement with Joseph Kennedy to sell his entire chain of theaters and theatrical real estate to the Radio Keith Orpheum Corporation, RKO, for $14 million. Difficulties rose, however. By now, Pantages had gained a reputation as an old goat, but whatever bad publicity this garnered, it did not impact his business. Rumors of a troubled marriage with his wife Lois Pantages, considering a divorce, reveal signs of an unstable private life. If Pantages was careless in his personal matters, perhaps it was an antidote to the many business challenges he faced. But allegations of car trips to Mexico with comely underage women raised disturbing questions. The model ethnic was not being a good role model to his audiences. He loved the theatrical world and being around beautiful, physically attractive people. Groucho Marx was quoted as saying, "Someday, I'm afraid, the eggheads will take Red Skelton up and start reading social significance into his antics. Let's hope they don't, because this has ruined many a good performer." By the late 1920s, Pantages was worth the equivalent of approximately $300 million in current dollars. That kind of money can change a person's living circumstances. But what about a person's character? Do the other family members become spoiled and out of touch? In Lois Pantages' case, it seems very likely. On June 16, 1929, Pantages' wife Lois caused a car accident that left a man dead and several others injured. That evening, Lois careened around Hollywood in her large Stutz with a shocking, reckless abandon. Used car salesman William Taylor was near Oxford Street and Santa Monica Boulevard when he noticed a woman at the wheel of a Stutz driving erratically. The car swerved, and it appeared to Taylor that the driver was not in control of the vehicle. He held his breath as it sideswiped another car and continued down the street at a high rate of speed. Hoping to stop the woman before someone came to harm, he followed her in his car as fast as he deemed safe. Although he kept her in sight, he couldn't match her pace. Harry Letterbrink first saw the Stutz at St. Andrew's Place and Beverly Boulevard, and he noticed that it was being driven in a very careless manner. He pulled up behind the car, and when it didn't move forward as the traffic signal turned green, he got out and went to see if the driver was in distress. He saw the woman with her head down, and she had a glassy stare. He drew closer and got a whiff of whiskey. He also noticed the registration certificate was made out in the name of Lois Pantages. He told the woman that she should pull her car to the curb and call a taxicab. But once she'd snapped out of her trance, she became verbally abusive and roared off, trailing dust and expletives. As C.F. Holmes, his wife, and another couple were driving down Western Avenue, the Stutz passed him on the wrong side of the road and clipped his fenders. The big car didn't slow down or stop, so Holmes followed it and watched in disbelief as the westbound car swerved into the eastbound lane of Sunset Boulevard. The driver made no hand signal and gave no indication of what she was intending to do. Then, as several people watched, the car crashed into a small, slow-moving sedan jam-packed with people. The sickening sound of metal on metal was accompanied by screams. Joe Rokumoto was at the wheel of his small Ford sedan. He was on Serrano Street attempting to cross Sunset Boulevard. He either didn't see the Stutz coupe bearing down on him, or saw it and was unable to evade it. The much larger auto completely demolished Joe's car and caused injuries to everyone in it. Those injured in the crash included Joe, 44, his wife, Karuko, 35, daughters Grace, 8, and Mary, 13. Also in the car with the Rokamuta family was Kiku Kawaguchi, 31, and her 2 kids, Hachiyoko, 7, and George, 9. The 3 adults were taken to Sylvan Lodge Hospital. The children, who despite the severity of the accident, received mostly minor lacerations and were sent home with friends. Lois Pantages, who had been observed driving recklessly for several blocks before finally plowing into Joe's car, was treated for a broken nose, lacerated upper lip, and a slight concussion and sent home. She wasn't home for long when the police knocked on her door and arrested her for driving while intoxicated. She was booked and then released on her own recognizance. The damage to Joe's car was complete. Lois's Stutz sustained front-end damage but was otherwise repairable, while Joe's car was a total loss and at least everyone had survived the accident. But that would change when, a couple days later, Joe died during the surgery to repair his broken hip. An inquest was held, and coroner's jury concluded that his death was a direct result of the accident, despite the possible contributing causes of a tuberculosis abscess of the pleura and tuberculosis of the lower spinal vertebrae. The jury didn't offer any recommendation for further action by the authorities, but it didn't matter because the DA had already taken steps to submit the case to the grand jury for an indictment. Detective Lieutenant J.R. Stevens interviewed the survivors in Joe's car, but he had not been able to get near Lois Pantages, who was allegedly too ill to be questioned. The initial report indicated that Lois had sustained only minor injuries in the craft, but her condition was upgraded to serious as the charge of second-degree murder loomed large before her. The court was informed that she was hospitalized and unavailable for questioning. She had supposedly undergone surgery, although it wasn't made clear exactly why she would need an operation for a split lip and a broken nose. If you're thinking it was her attorney's ploy to keep her away from the cops, then we're on the same page. District Attorney Burton Fitz said, "I have gone into the matter of Mrs. Pantages since my return this morning from the District Attorney's convention, and I am convinced that the facts justify a prosecution on the charge of murder in the second degree." Accordingly, Lois Pantages was arrested for second-degree manslaughter for killing a man while driving intoxicated. Her preliminary hearing was delayed because her doctor hadn't cleared her for release from the hospital. The DA wasn't especially concerned. He had his officers continue to question witnesses. He'd also put a stop to scheduled repairs on the Stutz. Joe's Ford sedan was beyond fixing. It was a crumpled mass of metal. Both vehicles would be held by the police until the case was concluded. In an effort to get his wife out of trouble, Pantages allegedly hired an old friend, William Paddy McGee, to bribe a cop who was on the scene of the accident and could testify to the fact that Lois was shit-faced and smelled like a distillery. The cop, William S. Dutton, testified at the coroner's inquest that he and his fellow officers had one hell of a time getting Lois out of her car and into an ambulance. Not because she was seriously hurt, but because she was combative. She kept saying she wanted to go home. When Officer Dutton visited her in the Dickey and Cass Hospital later, she said, "Get out of here. I don't want to see any policemen. I want to see my husband." On July 7, newspapers broke the story that a former police officer had been arrested for attempting to bribe one of the witnesses against Lois. Paddy McGee was a former special deputy sheriff and a bail bondsman. Paddy claimed to have been friends with Pantages for 35 years, and maybe he had been, but once his name appeared in connection with attempted bribery, he was persona non grata as far as the Pantages were concerned. Pantages said, "My attention was called to the paper this afternoon, wherein a man named McGee claims he was investigating the case for me. McGee was never employed by me or authorized to have anything to do with the case." Even though they'd known each other for decades, Pantages referred to Paddy as that McGee person, in an obvious effort to distance himself from both the messenger and the message. Paddy denied making any overture to Officer Dutton. The former lawman and brother-in-law of Tom Finn, ex-sheriff of San Francisco, stated, "I heard they were looking for me at the district attorney's office and went down there voluntarily to see what they wanted. There is no truth in the statement that I tried to bribe anyone." The DA disagreed, and Paddy was remanded into custody. It was Paddy's word against Alexander's, so guess who went to jail? If you guessed Paddy, you're right. Within 2 weeks of Paddy McGee's bribery matter, another witness came forward with a story not of attempted bribery, but of intimidation. Harry J. Letterbrink, a building contractor who lived at 2610 South Ridgely Drive, was asked by Deputy District Attorneys Costello and Jones if he would testify against Lois Pantages. He said, "I will unless something happens. I've been threatened in this case already." Letterbrink had received 2 threatening telephone calls, one telling him that he'd better not testify, and the second telling him to get out of town. Deputy DA Costello intended to trace the caller, but that would be easier said than done. Letterbrink's testimony was a blow to Lois's case. At the coroner's inquest, he testified that he first saw Lois driving erratically in her Stutz near Beverly Boulevard in St. Andrews Place. At the intersection of Western and Beverly, he tried to talk to her because he was convinced that she was in no condition to drive. When he leaned into the car to have a word, Letterbrink smelled whiskey. Lois wouldn't listen to Letterbrink when he suggested that she park her car and call a taxi. She went on to cause the accident that ended the life of Joe Rokumoto. By mid-July 1929, Lois Pantages was out on bail pending her trial for the murder of a gardener, Karuko Joe Rokumoto, while she was driving under the influence of alcohol. Shortly after noon, on July 17, Lois Pantages, surrounded by her family, was wheeled into Judge Holland's court for her preliminary hearing. Her attorney spoke for her and pleaded not guilty to driving while intoxicated and murder. She was released on $50,000 bail. That's equivalent to nearly $700,000 in current dollars. Alexander Pantages was wealthy enough to make bail for his wife and could afford the best attorneys. With the wealth and power of the Pantages fortune behind her, would Lois escape justice? On August 5th, Lois appeared in Superior Court Judge Agler's court and waived time for plea and entered a plea of not guilty. She demanded an early trial date. The judge obliged and set the date of Lois's trial for September 2nd in Department 24, Judge Hardy's court. On the evening of August 9, the media focus shifted from Lois's impending murder trial to Pantages, who suddenly had serious legal problems of his own. He had been booked at LAPD's Central Station on suspicion of statutory rape. The alleged victim, 17-year-old Eunice Pringle of 417 Acacia Street, Garden Grove, alleged that the old theater magnate had invited her into his private office, ostensibly to discuss her vaudeville act, but had attacked her instead. She said that she lost consciousness, and when she awakened a few minutes later, her clothes were in disarray. Eunice was screaming as she fled the office. Pantages told investigators the attack never happened and that it was a frame-up. Burton Fitz, who was fast becoming the Pantages family nemesis, acted quickly to indict Pantages. No fewer than 11 witnesses lined up to testify against him. He entered a not guilty plea, and his trial was set to begin on September 23rd, just a couple of weeks following his wife Lois's trial. Both Lois and Pantages were free on bail. Dinner conversations at the Pantages mansion must have been interesting. Lois was very involved in the selection of the jurors who would determine her fate. Did she wince when one of the prospective jurors said that while he'd served on several murder trial juries on the East Coast, he'd never sat on a jury in a homicide trial? Another potential juror, H.C. Hagee, told the court that he thought gasoline and whiskey would not mix and was excused for cause. Welcome, Lois, to a jury of your peers. One of the first things the jury did was take a field trip to the crash site. It was a circus. The judge, jurors, all of the attorneys, accompanied by a group of reporters and photographers, assembled at the intersection of Serrano Avenue and Sunset Boulevard. The jurors took in the scene, and then everyone was taken to view the wrecked cars. Lois' massive Stutz and Joe's small Ford sedan. It was a sobering show. The defense attorneys tried to push the blame for Joe's death onto the shoulders of the doctors who tried to repair his hip. The defense claimed that the surgery killed Joe, not Lois driving. The defense went further than blaming Joe's death on the anesthetic. They said that the accident was actually all Joe's fault because he was attempting a left turn from Serrano onto Sunset without giving a hand signal. Poor Lois rammed his car because she couldn't avoid it. Lois' trial brought a couple of LA's most outspoken religious leaders into the limelight. One of them, Reverend Robert P. Fighting Bob Schuler of Trinity Methodist Church, asserted on his radio program that the jury would be hung, and not only that, he knew the identity of the male juror who would be responsible. Subpoenaed, along with his crusading colleague, Reverend Gustav A. Breigleb, both men faced charges of contempt of court and were brought before Judge Hardy to answer for their utterances regarding Mrs. Lois Pantages' trial and the jury in the case. Under oath, Reverend Schuler admitted that he had based his radio statements on hearsay and anonymous letters. Rather than to telling a cop to lie or being irresponsible, Schuler instead chose to characterize his remarks as prophecy. The two pastors were charged with contempt of court and tried. Both were found guilty in order to pay fines. Schuler and Breigleb were not accustomed to being silenced and tried to play the free speech card, and when that didn't work, they tried to start a movement to recall Judge Hardy. The recall failed, and the three judges adjudicating the case, Hardy, Gold, and Tappan, denounced Fighting Bob's radio tirades and accused him of attempting to incite a mob. 3 weeks into the trial, the jurors boarded a bus bound for the Los Angeles County Fair at Pomona. It was Judge Hardy's idea. He wanted the jurors to stay healthy and in good spirits, and since he desperately needed a day away from the courtroom too, he accompanied them. Relaxed and refreshed following their day at the fair, Judge Hardy and the jurors entered the courtroom ready to resume their respective civic duties. A few days later, impassioned closing statements by the defense and the prosecuting attorney signaled the end of the trial. It was time for the jury of 5 women and 7 men to deliberate. It took the jury 7 hours and 45 minutes to find Lois Pantages guilty of manslaughter in Joe Roccamuto's death. In their verdict, the jury said, "The Stutz was driven on the left-hand side of the highway, and we find the accident was due to reckless driving on the part of the driver of said Stutz automobile." Upon hearing the sentence, Lois first sat immobile, lips quivering. She finally broke into sobs, as did all of the female jurors, though whether the jurors were crying for Joe or Lois wasn't clear. If they felt it was a bad business all the way around, they were right. Lois, who was standing to hear the verdict read, began to slump towards the floor. Deputy Sheriff Hazel M. Brown rushed to her side and gently assisted the woman back to her chair. Lois' family and counsel took her into the judge's chambers, and her doctor worked her over for nearly 30 minutes. She finally recovered just enough to be carried by her sons to a car and driven home. Having been found guilty, Lois faced a sentence from 1 to 10 years. In 1929, female felons were still being incarcerated at San Quentin. For any woman, especially one accustomed to the finer things, it was a dreary and terrifying prospect. Lois's attorneys wanted probation for their client, not prison, and to that end, they delivered a mass of documents supporting their request. The materials would be reviewed by probation officers, and they would then make a recommendation to Judge Hardy. Lois had some heavy hitters on her side, and many well-known and wealthy philanthropists were deposed. Carmen Pantages worked tirelessly on her mother's behalf. While Lois awaited sentencing, William Patty McGee appeared before Judge Frick on the bribery charge. Frick, who was also hearing Pantages' statutory rape case, listened to Patty's denials for about 2 hours. He then found him guilty and sentenced him to from 1 to 14 years in prison. Courtroom observers described Patty as stunned by the verdict and the sentence, but other than filing an appeal, there was nothing he could do. On November 8th, Lois Pantages appeared before Judge Hardy for sentencing. The judge granted her request for probation and gave 5 reasons for doing so. The preponderance of evidence produced during the trial indicated that Mrs. Pantages had not been drinking before the accident. Mrs. Pantages and her attorneys had agreed on a sum of money to be paid in compensating persons injured in the accident. Mrs. Pantages had led a Christian life and devoted much of her time and money to welfare work and had never before been charged with a felony. Her health is such that a sentence to prison virtually would be a sentence to death, despite the fact that she was convicted only of manslaughter. And consideration of all the evidence and legal phases of the case indicated that she is entitled to probation, and the fact that she has wealth and position should not discriminate against her. The term of Lois' probation was set at 10 years, and even though according to Judge Hardy there was a preponderance of evidence that she had not been drinking, one of the conditions of her release was that she refrained from the use of alcohol and must never drive an automobile. Judge Hardy then ordered Lois to pay $78,500, which is the equivalent to several $1 million in today's dollars, to the persons injured in the accident within 5 days as a full settlement of their claims. It's interesting to note that Lois's injuries went from a broken nose and a few minor contusions, as reported immediately following the crash, to a congested condition in one lung, heart disease, and general nervousness when it came time for sentencing. District Attorney Burton Fitz was not pleased with the outcome. He said, "It is the policy of my office neither to oppose nor approve probation for any defendant. That is a question for the court to decide. However, I would like to inquire if the court would have reached the same decision had the defendant in this case been Joe Roccamuto instead of Mrs. Pantages." Most everyone else wonders the same thing. The famous evangelist Times Semple, branded as untrue and ridiculous, reports that he visited at the home of Mrs. Lois Pantages after she went home for being found guilty.